The palace woke to war drums that no herald dared claim. Cold torchlight bled across marble as Emperor Cassian paced, his jaw locked against rumor. Lord Varro said, "The frontier reports are confused." Cassian said, "Confusion is a tactic." A runner slipped, breath breaking on stone, and Captain Marcus caught him before fear cracked louder. Ilyn hugged the shadows near a tapestry, eyes wide at words meant for iron ears. General Octavian said, "Mobilize the inner guard and bar the archives." Cassian said, "Truth is kept there, not merely maps." A bell tolled once, then choked, as if strangled by a gloved hand. Selene watched from a gallery slit, the storm painting silver on her cheek. Varro said, "I will secure the cipher room." Cassian said, "Take 2 men you trust." Marcus felt the room tilt, for Varro trusted only mirrors. The archive smelled of damp vellum and iron, a place where lies aged into footnotes. Marcus trailed the scribe, counting locks that should have been sealed. Ilyn carried a lamp that jittered like her breath. Cassian said, "Open the Imperial Ledger," and the room answered with silence. Varro said, "Missing pages are a clerical matter." Octavian said, "Clerks do not steal seals." The lamp spit and died, and darkness folded its wings over shelves of empire. Selene's presence was a rumor in the rafters, felt more than seen. Marcus said, "Who handled the cipher chest last?" A feather of ash drifted from the ledger spine. Cassian said, "Truth burns when handled by cowards." Varro smiled so slightly that guilt could not anchor it. Dawn bruised the horizon as the council gathered in a hall lined with conquered banners. Cassian said, "Our roads carry rumors faster than grain." Octavian said, "Then cut the rumor's tongue." Marcus watched Varro's hands, too still for honesty. Ilyn stood by the door, small as a candle among storms. Selene lingered in the gallery, counting exits like a prayer. A messenger knelt and offered a cipher strip, its edges singed. Varro said, "An intercepted forgery." Cassian said, "Or a confession that survived fire." Octavian said, "Name the traitor and I will raise the axe." The hall breathed as if a beast waited in its ribs. The cipher room yawned like a mouth missing teeth. A chest lay open, its velvet throat scarred by heat. Marcus said, "This was burned from within." Ilyn traced a singe and flinched. Cassian said, "Someone fed our future to a spark." Varro said, "Best to close the room till auditors arrive." Octavian said, "Best to close traitors in it." Selene shifted behind a lattice and watched Varro's eyes reflect the embers that were not there. A lone seal lay on the floor, pressed with the imperial falcon, but canted wrong. Marcus said, "Who stamps a falcon beak first?" Varro said, "A nervous clerk." Cassian did not answer, and the silence felt like a verdict rehearsing itself. Rain relented to a thin hiss as the court dispersed, but the hallway kept its echo. Cassian said, "Truth walks with a limp today." Marcus said, "I will find its stride." Varro said, "Your zeal flatters the crown." Octavian said, "Results flatter the realm." Ilyn carried a folded scrap she had not meant to take. Selene stepped into her path, voice soft as a hidden blade. Selene said, "You dropped that earlier," and handed Ilyn a duplicate, the ink reversed like a mirror. Ilyn said, "Which one is real?" Selene said, "The one that endangers you." Cassian stared at the ceiling where the bell rope would cross his thoughts. The day felt heavier, as if history had added a stone to each breath. The storm lifted but left its taste on stone and throat. Cassian walked the gardens where roses drowned in last night's rain. He said, "What emperor rules when rumor owns the air?" Marcus followed, boots soft on mud, hand resting near his sword. Marcus said, "Loyalty still breathes, sire." Cassian said, "Loyalty breathes. But does it bleed?" Ilyn hurried behind, clutching a parchment against her chest. She said, "This was hidden in the servant quarters." Varro appeared at the arch, cloak neat as if storms had no claim on him. Varro said, servants spin tales when coins are scarce. Cassian turned sharply, eyes cutting like steel against silk. Selene leaned on a marble column, unseen to most, yet her gaze traced every word spoken. The garden's silence pressed heavier than thunder, and the emperor's breath looked more like smoke than life. The council chamber creaked as if the beams themselves distrusted what was spoken. Octavian slammed a gauntlet on the oak table. He said, "Our soldiers whisper mutiny." Cassian said, "Whispers break faster than shields." Varro said, "They break faster when fed." Marcus's jaw tightened as he leaned forward, voice low. Marcus said, "Then starve the traitors of lies." Ellen trembled at the edge, ink-stained fingers clutching her sleeve. Selene stood near the shutter, eyeing the horizon with quiet suspicion. Cassian's voice lowered, tired but sharp. He said, "The Empire does not fear enemies at its walls. It fears the ones already seated at its table." Silence stretched until even torches flickered uncertainly, as if the chamber itself had swallowed air. In the barracks, the scent of oil and sweat mingled with dread. Marcus paced between rows of uneasy soldiers. He said, "Steel does not serve those who doubt their own grip." A young soldier asked, "Do we fight for crown or coin?" Marcus stopped, fire flickering in his eyes. He said, "You fight for each other, or you die alone." Outside, rain-drummed shields stacked in careless piles. Ellen delivered rations, her small hands steadying trembling palms. Varro entered, words like silk over blades. He said, "Courage without bread is hunger in armor." Marcus turned, voice rising. He said, "And bread without courage is ash in the mouth." Soldiers exchanged glances, the hall vibrating with the choice between oaths and fear. The chapel smelled of wax and regret. Cassian knelt at the altar, crown resting at his side. He whispered, "Does history forgive or only endure?" Ellen stood in the back, hands folded, her shadow stretching against the wall. Octavian entered, voice deep as a war drum. Octavian said, "Faith will not march in your stead." Cassian said, "Faith steadies what swords cannot." Varro lingered at the doorway, lips curved in faint disdain. Selene watched him instead of the altar, her eyes narrowed. Cassian rose, the crown heavy again in his grasp. "But," he said, "if Empire bleeds, I bleed first." The candles wavered as if shamed by his vow, their light bending away from the gathering storm outside. Night fell with fireflies over the courtyard, but no one marveled. Marcus sparred alone, blade clashing against phantom foes. He said, "Better to sweat here than bleed unready." Ilyn approached, voice soft. She said, "Even shadows grow weary." Marcus lowered his sword, breath ragged. He said, "Shadows cannot betray me." Selene stepped from the colonnade, voice cutting the night. "What?" Selene said, "But men can." Marcus froze, his knuckles whitening on the hilt. From a balcony Cassian watched, cloak drawn tight. Varro appeared beside him, voice honeyed. Varro said, "Your captain doubts his ghosts more than his enemies." Cassian's eyes narrowed, yet he spoke nothing, only the silence of a man learning which lies to starve and which to burn. War drums rolled from the hills like stones loosening from a grave. Cassian studied the campaign map, while water bled from his cloak hemdal. He said, "If roads carry fear, pave them with orders." Octavian said, "Spears wait for a signal." Marcus scanned the room, weighing every breath as if it were steel. Varro said, "Delay," and the rebels quarrel among themselves. Selene stood in the arch, measuring angles, not faces. Ellen hovered near the inkstand, lips pressed against a question. Cassian said, "Questions save lives when answers are false." Octavian said, "Then name the throat we cut first." Varro smiled without teeth. Marcus said, "We strike supply, not men, and spare blood until guilt speaks." Selene said, "Guilt already speaks in missing pages." Ellen said, and in a seal pressed upside down. The chamber paused, airtight as a drumhead, before the storm broke against the shutters again. The courtyard steamed where rain met hot iron. Smiths hammered horseshoes while rumors hammered hearts. Marcus said, "Arm the riders, but break camp light." Octavian said, "Weight slows courage." Cassian walked between lines, touching helms like blessings. He said, "Hold fast, and history holds you." Varro murmured to a courier, voice smooth as oil on water. Celine watched the exchange and tipped her chin toward Eileen. Celine said, "Count how many messages leave and how few return." Ellen nodded, spine stiffening under fear's hand. Marcus caught the courier's eye, and the eye slid away. Octavian said, "I smell hesitation." Cassian said, "Hesitation smells like smoke before fire." Bells from the tower stuttered, then steadied, and the riders glanced north as if dragged by a wire. In the council gallery, banners drooped like tired tongues. Varro unrolled a chart, pointing to a pass that looked harmless. "Varro said our enemy prefers this valley." Marcus frowned at the contour lines that lied politely. Marcus said, "Ambush lives where kindness lives." Octavian said, "I prefer cliffs to courtesies." Cassian traced a second route like a scar across the hills. He said, "We split, then fold like a blade." Celine's hand hovered over the margin where cipher marks had been scraped. Celine said, "This map has been corrected by fire." Aelin whispered, "Ash in the fibers here." Varro said, "Soot from torches, nothing more." Marcus met Cassian's eyes, and the room leaned toward a decision that felt heavier than iron. The supply yard smelled of damp grain and fear. Wagons waited like patient beasts under canvas. Marcus said, "We move tonight, and leave ghosts to guard our prince." Aelin tucked a copy of the cipher beneath her sash. She said, "If I'm stopped, I will say it is laundry tally." Celine handed her a wax bead no larger than a tear. Celine said, "Crush this and I will find you." Octavian strode past, counting wheels, counting doubts. Octavian said, "Spokes break when rumors ride them." Cassian arrived with a nod that felt like a shield. He said, "You will not be alone on any road I rule." Varro watched from the colonnade, still as a portrait, while a courier slipped away toward the north gate. Night swallowed the road beyond the gate, and the wind tasted of iron. Riders formed a thin line that looked brave from a tower and fragile from the ground. Marcus said, "No fires, and speak with your hands." Octavian said, "If they spring, we spring harder." Cassian lifted his palm, and the column slid forward like a drawn breath. Celine slipped into the shadows beside the rear wagon. She said, "I count 2 watchers beyond the ditch." Aelin pressed her lips together and gripped the seat rail. Varro appeared beside Cassian, voice low. "Varro said, may fortune favor bold choices." Cassian said, "Fortune prefers honest maps." The gate chains uncoiled, and history clicked like a lock finding its last tooth. The valley whispered of betrayal before steel ever sang. Cassian rode at the front, eyes narrowing at smoke where no hearth should burn. He said, "Signals dressed as villages." Octavian growled, "Then we ride not to greet but to strike." Marcus scanned the ridges, catching shadows that did not belong. Ellen clutched the wax bead Celine had given her, pulse racing. Celine whispered, "Crows gather where carrion waits." Varro rode near Cassian, his face unreadable, his tone smooth. Varro said, "Perhaps farmers burn fields in fear." Cassian turned slowly, voice heavy. He said, "Fear burns differently from deceit." A horn blared harsh as a blade on bone, and the valley exhaled soldiers hidden in grass. The ambush burst like a trap long laid. Arrows cut the sky, and shields rang like drums. Marcus shouted, "Form ranks, cover the wagons." Octavian bellowed, "Advance, crush their line before it grows." Cassian steadied his horse as bolts clanged off iron. Varro leaned close, his words soft amid chaos. Varro said, "Withdraw to the pass, Let them choke in pursuit. Cassian said, withdraw, and we feed them courage. Selene's dagger flashed as she cut down a scout creeping from the flank. Ilyn ducked beneath a cart, heart pounding like a smith's hammer. Smoke crawled across the ground, swallowing faces in its coil, and the battle stretched into something darker than strategy. The clash slowed to whispers of steel over corpses. Cassian dismounted, cloak torn, voice hoarse. He said, "This valley was chosen with our maps." Marcus wiped blood from his cheek, rage caged in his eyes. He said, "Someone fed them routes meant for us." Ilyn crawled from the wreck, holding the cipher scrap like a lifeline. She said, "This matches the ash mark we found." Selene narrowed her gaze on Varro, who knelt to bind a feigned wound. Octavian spat on the dirt, saying, "Only those within the council had reach." Cassian's silence struck harder than any verdict, and the valley's mist thickened as if to cloak the traitor standing in daylight. The survivors gathered in the ruined chapel that overlooked the valley. Candles bent in the draught as Cassian placed his crown on the altar, the gold stained with ash. He said, "If a king cannot guard his truth, he guards nothing." Octavian said, "Name the traitor, and the axe will follow." Marcus's hand hovered near his sword, eyes fixed on Varro. Varro lifted his chin, expression smooth as polished marble. He said, "If suspicion is your crown, every man here is guilty." Selene whispered, "Not every man leaves footprints before the fire." Ilyn unfolded the cipher strip, voice breaking. She said, "This was in the courier's pouch." Cassian's gaze fixed on Varro, silence louder than thunder. Midnight cloaked the palace as storms gnawed the towers. Cassian stood alone in the throne hall, torchlight trembling on his face. He said, "Empires fall not by armies but by trust unguarded." Marcus entered, voice firm. Marcus said, "Your men stand ready, even if your walls do not." Octavian thundered in behind him, saying, "We strike tomorrow, end this rot before it spreads." Varro appeared from the shadows, bowing low, his eyes bright with secrets. Varro said, "Your enemies think you blind, but I guide your steps." Selene lingered unseen in the rafters, her hand wrapped around the hilt of a blade. Ilyn whispered near the door, "The walls are listening." Lightning ripped the sky, and the throne cast a jagged shadow like a warning. The ruined chapel held more ghosts than prayers. Cassian faced the council table, the cipher strip laid open like a wound. He said, "This mark mirrors the ash on our maps." Varro said, "Accidents breed patterns when fear is hungry." Marcus stepped closer, voice steady. He said, "Patterns breed verdicts." Selene pointed to a faint reversal in the seal. She said, "This was pressed with a mirror plate." Ilyn drew a breath that shook the candlelight. She said, "The mirror plate was kept in the treasurer's vault." Octavian said, "Name the keeper." Ilyn whispered, "Lord Varro holds that key." Silence collected like frost along the stone, and even the flames seemed to bend away from the truth. Dawn broke thin over the palace roofs as horns cried alarm. Soldiers flooded the courtyard, while banners shivered. Varro stood on the balcony and raised a decree. Varro said, "By emergency law, command passes to the regent." Cassian stared upward, shock buried under iron. He said, "Who crowned you when I yet breathe?" Octavian swore and called the guard to hold the stairs. Marcus said, "This is theft with ceremony." Selene's voice cut the wind. She said, "He had riders leave at midnight." Ilyn lifted two scraps that matched edge to edge. She said, "Orders forged from the same plate." The crowd wavered, as if the stone beneath had turned to water. The throne hall turned to a courtroom without mercy. Varro stepped forward, smile sharpened. "Varro," said for safety, "Cassian will retire to the inner tower." Cassian said, "History will measure your safety by your noose." Marcus drew half a blade, then held. He said, "One cut begins 1,000 deaths." Octavian said, "Say the word, and I end this fear." Selene moved to the dais edge and lifted a small signet. she said, found in the courier's boot, engraved backward. Ellen placed the mirror plate beside it, edges black with soot. She said, matched by weight and scar. The hall inhaled as if a great beast prepared to roar, and Varro's polish cracked like glazing in fire. Varro laughed once, brittle as ice, then tore off the velvet calm. Varro said, I bled for this empire when your mercy starved it. Cassian said, you fed only your shadow. Octavian surged forward, but Marcus barred his path. Marcus said, justice must be seen, not guessed. Selene stepped between Light and Varro, voice quiet. She said, I serve the old spy network, and I serve the crown. Ellen unfolded a hidden parchment. She said, the intercept lists payments to riders named by Varro. The hall swayed with whispers turned to knives. Cassian raised his palm, and the noise broke like surf on rock. He said, Lord Varro, you stand unmasked. The air thinned until words cut. Varro stepped back toward the side door where loyal blades waited. Varro said, choose captain, crown, or survival. Marcus looked to Cassian, then to the soldiers who trusted him. He said, I choose what lets them live with their names. Selene said, there is a path that spares blood and ends this lie. Ellen cried, the tower gears jam if the south chain is cut. Octavian said, give me the order. Cassian's eyes burned, then cooled like tempered steel. He said, take Varro alive and take back our maps. Marcus moved, fast as a verdict, and the hall surged as if history itself had leapt. Storms cracked above the palace as soldiers flooded the square. Cassian stood on the battlements, rain carving lines into his face. He said, the empire bleeds inside its own veins. Octavian barked, shields to the gates, break their charge. Marcus raised his sword high, voice sharp as iron. Marcus said, hold your ground, or history will spit on our names. Ellen clutched the cipher strips close to her chest, whispering, if the south chain breaks, the tower falls. Selene slid through the shadows below, her dagger reflecting lightning. Varro stood with his men near the inner arch, cloak drenched, voice booming. Varro said, the throne is hollow, and I claim its echo. Thunder drowned the last word, and steel clashed in the rain's roar. The gates shuddered as rams struck, wood splintering under iron. Marcus shouted, shields lock, brace the line. Octavian roared, pikes forward, spear them as they break. Cassian's voice carried over the storm. He said, no stone yields without witness. Ellen ran to the tower chains, hands trembling as she pulled at the gears. Selene appeared beside her, whispering, cut the south pin or they flood us all. Varro's men surged through the breach, cloaks black as shadows, blades flashing. Varro called, spill their loyalty on these stones. Cassian's glare followed him, sharp as thunder's crack. Blood met rain in rivers that swallowed cries too quickly to be remembered. Inside the throne hall, chaos swirled like smoke. Marcus clashed steel against Varro's captain, sparks leaping across the marble. Octavian drove men toward the dais, shouting, protect the emperor. Cassian gripped the throne's armrest, knuckles white as arrows shattered the stained glass. Ellen ducked under the balcony with parchments pressed against her chest. Selene leapt from the gallery, blade sinking into a mercenary's side. She said, traitors cut their own throats first. Varro strode up the central carpet, sword drawn, eyes blazing. Varro said, this hall is my birthright. Cassian rose, cloak heavy with rain, voice unyielding. He said, it will be your grave. Lightning painted the hall silver as steel rang like bells. The duel at the dais thundered louder than the storm. Marcus blocked Varro's slash, sparks flying between them. Marcus said, you betray every oath ever spoken. Varro sneered, oaths feed only graves. Cassian called, alive, not slain, he faces judgment. Octavian growled, judgment wastes breath better spent on victory. Selene's dagger clanged against another blade as she forced back Varro's guard. Ellen scrambled to the gears above, shouting, "The south chain is cut, the tower will not fall." The crowd of soldiers roared, each blow echoing across the vaulted ceiling. Varro lunged, blade grazing Marcus's cheek. "Ow!" Marcus answered with a crushing strike, driving him back. The throne hall felt like history was breaking stone by stone. The hall heaved with silence, broken only by ragged breaths. Varro staggered, sword knocked from his hand, blood tracing his jaw. Marcus pressed his blade to Varro's chest but held. Cassian said, "Chains, not blades, finish treachery." Octavian snarled, "Mercy dishonors the fallen." Ellen cried, "Proof lives in his hand, not his death." Selene lowered her dagger, gaze steady on Cassian. "Selene," said Alive. "He damns himself in every word." Varro spat. "You think victory belongs to crowns? It belongs to vultures." Cassian stepped closer, eyes burning. He said, "Then you will feed them with silence." Chains clattered as soldiers seized Varro, and the storm outside bowed with a fading roll of thunder. Dawn crept over broken marble and quieted the last echoes of steel. Cassian stood at the window where storms had judged the night. He said, "Victory tastes of ash when trust lies buried." Marcus gathered battered helms and set them in a line. He said, "Names deserve order even when the world is bent." Ellen folded the cipher strips and exhaled the fear trapped between them. Selene watched the courtyards, counting the living with careful eyes. She said, "Survivors need truth more than orders." Octavian paced, anger cooling into shape. He said, "Justice now, not later." Varro stared from chains, a smile cracked and empty. "Varro," said, "power chooses new owners each morning." Cassian turned, voice steadier than the light. He said, "Then let the morning choose honor." The tribunal convened in the throne hall, stripped of banners. Cassian refused the seat and stood among soldiers. He said, "Judgment stands higher when it stands on the floor." Octavian read charges that clanged like iron gates. Varro lifted his chin and offered silk where rope waited. Varro said, "I saved the realm from softness." Marcus held up the reversed signet and the mirror plate. He said, "You saved yourself from consequence." Ellen placed ledgers that tied coin to riders under moonlight. Selena's voice cut clean. She said, "Your shadow bought every step of this night." Cassian's gaze fixed like a seal on wax. He said, "The Empire answers with law, not appetite." Verdict struck like a bell that could not unring. Cassian said, "By law, exile spares blood and remembers guilt." Octavian frowned but bowed to the words. He said, "Let the road show him its teeth." Varro's smile thinned into winter. "Varro," said Exile, "plant seeds you cannot see." Marcus stepped close, voice quiet and hard. He said, "So does honor, and it grows where you cannot cut." Ellen approached with a sealed letter for the archives. She said, "Records will keep the night honest." Selene nodded once, as if a ledger had balanced. She said, "Truth stands when witnesses refuse to kneel." Cassian lifted his hand and history accepted the gesture. The escort moved through the north gate under a sky empty of omens. Varro looked back once, eyes measuring walls he had failed to bend. He said, "Crowns rust faster than daggers." Marcus answered without heat. He said, "Rust spares those who put down the blade." Ellen watched from the parapet, fingers tight on the ledger strap. Selene stood near, gaze on the road that swallowed pride. She said, "Exile is a mirror without flattering light." Octavian muttered, "If he returns, the axe will speak." Cassian rested a hand on the cold stone and let the city breathe. He said, "Let mercy cost me, not them." Night returned, but it felt lighter in the bones. Cassian walked the silent gardens where rain had once drowned roses. He said, "Power is borrowed, duty is owned." Marcus set broken spears beside replanted standards. He said, "Let tomorrow find us upright." Ellen placed the cipher strips in the archive vault and closed the door soft as a vow. Celine lingered near the gate, half shadow and half sentinel. She said, "The quiet after truth is the loudest sound." Octavian sheathed his sword and finally breathed. He said, "Let the drums rest." The moon lifted like a clean seal across the sky, and the empire held.